Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we're venturing into the really fascinating, sometimes tricky world of English politeness.
Hmm.
You've got some really interesting material about how we use language to be considerate, sometimes in ways that aren't totally straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. It's not always obvious what's going on beneath the surface.
All right. So our mission today is basically to unpack some of these nuances, these communication strategies, hopefully so you, the listener, can navigate conversations, with a bit more confidence, maybe understand what people really mean sometimes.
Definitely. We'll be looking at things like the Canadian paradox, which is quite interesting,
Ah, yes, that one.
and the power of using softening words. That whole "I was wondering if" trick,
Oh, that's a classic.
and even how different cultures sort of tackle politeness. It's quite a puzzle.
It really is. So let's start maybe with that Canadian paradox you mentioned. The sources point this out, right? This tendency to over apologize. Yeah. Or use really indirect phrasing, like the example, could you maybe, if it's not too much trouble, something like that.
Sounds incredibly nice on the surface.
It does. But if you look closer, it's really a polite way to make a request without sounding too pushy.
So less of a command, more of a gentle nudge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wrapped in layers of what linguists sometimes call mitigation, using words to sort of soften the blow, you could say.
Right, like we're trying to cushion the request before we even make it, which connects nicely to the next idea, doesn't it? Softening words.
Yes, definitely.
Your material have that great example.
Yeah.
Could you just move a little to the left versus, well, the less subtle?
Get out of my way. Yeah.
Ah, quite the contrast. Adding words like just, maybe, a little, it completely changes the feel, doesn't it?
It really does. Takes the harsh edge off completely.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, I think, is how these tiny little words, seemingly insignificant, have such a huge impact on how the message lands. Just can make the tasks seem smaller, maybe adds that element of choice, or at least apparent choice.
And a little minimizes the scale of it.
Exactly. But it does make you wonder, I mean, is there a point where you soften it so much that the actual message gets a bit lost?
That's a really good question. Too much softening might just muddy the waters.
Could do.
And speaking of, not being direct, negative questions. This is another interesting one from the sources.
All right. Yeah.
Asking something like, you couldn't help me, could you? Instead of just, can you help me? Why is that often seen as more polite? Feels almost backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah. But it's actually quite a clever linguistic trick.
How so?
Well, the negative framing sort of gives the other person an easier out. It makes it less awkward for them to say no if they need to.
Okay, so you're not assuming they can or will help.
Precisely. It implies you're acknowledging they might not be able to, giving them that polite escape route. So it feels less demanding, more respectful of their, time or limitations.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to what one source calls upgrading your requests.
This is where things get really skillful, I guess.
Yeah, some real finesse here.
Like the classic, I was wondering if you'd had a chance to look at my email. We all kind of know that often means.
Answer me already.
Exactly. But much nicer. Much nicer, yes. I was wondering if construction, it just softens it. It frames it as like a passing thought, an inquiry, not a demand.
Suggest patience, consideration, even if you're internally drumming your fingers.
Right. It's a subtle way to apply a bit of pressure but keep that polite facade firmly in place.
Then there's the could you possibly hack? Just adding that one word, possibly.
Okay. Mm.
Could you possibly proofread this? Versus just, proofread this. Big difference.
Huge difference. It introduces that element of choice again, or at least the illusion of choice.
Right, like you're genuinely giving them the option,
Yep.
even if the expectation is...
That they'll probably do it, yeah. But it acknowledges their autonomy, makes it feel less like an order. It encourages cooperation by framing it as sort of a voluntary thing.
Very clever. And the last one in this toolkit, the time buffer trick.
Ah!
Phrases like, whenever you get a moment, or no rush, but...
Even when there is a rush.
Exactly. The source joked it often means, do it now, but I'll pretend I'm patient.
That sounds about right. It's about appearing flexible and considerate about their time, even if the underlying need is actually quite urgent. Maintains politeness, signals the need, hopes for the best.
Okay, so that's making requests. Now let's flip it. How do we politely say no? Often, it seems, without actually saying the word no.
Yes, the art of the indirect refusal. The sources have some great examples.
Like the let me circle back dodge.
Oh, a classic office maneuver.
One source basically translates it as, Never.
Yeah.
Is it really that final?
Well, it often can be, yeah. It sounds like you're just postponing, that you'll genuinely return to it. And sometimes maybe people do, but very often it's just a way to avoid a direct no. It feels, I suppose, more graceful than outright rejection.
Keeps the door slightly ajar, even if you have no intention of walking through it again.
Something like that.
Then there's the interesting filter, especially noted in British English.
Yes, the power of interesting.
Apparently saying, that's an interesting idea, can be a very polite code for it.
That's a truly dreadful idea.
Huh. Is it really that coded?
In certain contexts, absolutely. It comes down to cultural understanding, doesn't it? Understatement is a big part of politeness in, say, British culture. Saying something is merely interesting when you think it's awful, avoids direct conflict, smooths the social interaction.
You need the cultural decoder ring for that one.
You really do. It requires a certain literacy in those unspoken rules.
Okay, and another classic. I'll keep you posted. The ghosting phrase.
Sometimes, yes. The source suggests it can mean, you'll likely never hear from me again on this.
Wow. So it sounds helpful, sounds proactive.
But the intention might be the opposite. It's, again, about perhaps prioritizing that short-term social ease over long-term clarity. Maybe an aversion to delivering bad news directly.
Fascinating. And the sources even mention a sort of listener hack, the I'll check my calendar and let you know move.
Followed by strategic forgetfulness.
Right. Another way to dodge commitment without saying no.
It just shows the lengths people sometimes go to, doesn't it? To avoid that direct refusal. The social pressure to be agreeable, or at least seem agreeable, is pretty strong.
Definitely. Which leads us nicely into these cultural politeness landmines, how politeness looks different across cultures.
Crucial stuff. Easy to misunderstand if you're not aware.
Okay, so the sources mention Americans and fake enthusiasm. Right, that's awesome. Might just mean go?
Yeah, in some American context, a certain level of expressed enthusiasm is kind of the baseline for politeness. It's expected.
So it can feel a bit performative sometimes.
It can, yeah. It's often more about showing positive engagement, even if the actual feeling is more neutral. It's just a cultural norm of affirmation.
Okay, then back to the Brits. Understatement is sarcasm.
Right.
The example given is pretty extreme. It's a bit windy, potentially meaning a hurricane is brewing.
Well, maybe not quite a hurricane, but certainly indicating something much more severe than a bit windy. It's that tendency to downplay things.
Or humor, or...
It could be humor, self-deprecation, or just a cultural preference for, not making a fuss, avoiding overt drama or strong emotion. But for an outsider, it can be baffling. You might seriously underestimate the situation.
You might need to check the weather forecast yourself.
Halfway-wise, yeah.
And then, looping back, the Canadians apologizing for existing.
The Canadian paradox in full swing.
Saying, sorry, but, before practically anything. Even the source jokes, sorry, but you're on fire.
Haha. It highlights that deep-seated cultural emphasis on politeness, on deference, on not wanting to impose or offend, even when an apology is logically completely unnecessary.
It's almost like a verbal tick, but a polite one.
In a way, yeah. A way of acknowledging the other person constantly.
So the sources offer a pro tip here, which seems sensible, if you're unsure about politeness cues in a different culture.
Mirror the locals. Pay attention to how people around you are communicating.
Yeah, watch and learn. They gave that example, hearing that's certainly a choice, and understanding it might mean.
That's terrible. Burn it immediately.
Right. It just hammers home how vital context and cultural awareness are.
Absolutely. Politeness isn't universal. What's polite in London might be rude in Los Angeles, or vice versa. You have to tune in.
Okay, so for our listeners, this week's mission, drawing from the sources, we've got a few things to try.
Okay, challenges.
First, just try to spot someone using a softening phrase like, would you mind, or could you just? See if you notice it now.
Good listening exercise.
Second, maybe try upgrading one of your own demands. Instead of, say, send me the file, try, would you possibly be able to send me the file? Or whenever you get a chance, see how it feels.
Experiment a little.
And finally, this one's maybe a bit trickier. In the right situation, try saying that's one way to do it with a completely straight face.
Use with caution.
Definitely use with caution. And remember that other example, hearing, I'll see what I can do, and thinking, maybe that means I'll do nothing.
Yeah, becoming aware of these potential hidden meanings, but is there a risk here? Could becoming too aware make us sort of overthink everything, make interactions feel unnatural.
That's a really good point. You don't want to get paralyzed analyzing every word.
Exactly. There's a balance, isn't there? Awareness is good, helps you navigate, but overanalysis could kill the conversation. Ideally, it becomes more of an intuitive understanding over time.
Right. So, wrapping up our deep dive for today, it seems English politeness is often this complex dance, creating an illusion, maybe, of flexibility of choice.
While still often aiming for a specific outcome.
Yeah, it's about softening the edges, being indirect, and crucially, understanding that what's said isn't always a perfect match for what's meant.
And being aware of the cultural lens, always.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Mastering these nuances, or at least being aware of them, can definitely help communication flow better, help avoid those awkward misunderstandings.
for sure. And maybe a final thought to leave listeners with. Consider the power dynamics often wrapped up in these polite phrases.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, who tends to use these more indirect, softening forms of speech and in what situations? Is it always the person asking for something or someone in a less powerful position?
Ah, that's a deep cut. What does the way we use politeness tell us about social structures, about expectations between people?
Exactly. It's worth thinking about how these subtle language choices reflect and maybe even reinforce broader social dynamics. Perhaps even notice your own patterns. When do you use these strategies most?
Hmm. Plenty to chew on there. A great place to leave it.